we're going to talk tonight. We're going to talk about preparing your garden. So first, just a little bit about me. My name, as I said, is Dave McConville, and I am a permaculture designer and educator. And for those of you not familiar with permaculture, it is basically a design process that has its principles rooted in the observation of natural patterns, systems, processes, and using those observations and patterns in your design. So very much mimicking nature and natural systems and processes. So the picture here is of my backyard and my garden. This is late summer, so end of August or so, and it's a little bit unkempt, but it's more natural than some of the traditional ones, and that's kind of the food forest I have going on back there. So, but as I said, tonight we're going to talk about preparing your garden, and I'm going to spend maybe just 5 minutes reviewing the planning class that we had last time, just talk about some of the highlights to review for some who may not have been there. And then we're going to get onto soil, what is soil and how to care for it, followed by talking about what the steps are to actually prepare your bed and get it ready for growing. And we're going to finish off with talking about some of the cool season crops, things that you can start planting end of March through April and early May, and seeds, crops that you either direct sow or transplant. So we'll talk about those at the end. So first, just as I said, a little review of the planting plan. And essentially, when you come up with a planting plan, you want to focus on, what you're going to grow, when you're going to grow it, and where you're going to put it. So, the what, where, and when. So you end up with a plant list, a schedule for when those plants go in the ground or when the seeds get started, and then where you're going to finally locate those in your garden. Doesn't matter whether it's small or large. The planning is the same process, just depends on the size of the space. Tonight, as with our other class, we're going to kind of focus on raised beds because the most of the people who are going to be attending tonight are probably going to be growing with us, and we have raised beds in our 7 sites around the city. So we're going to kind of focus on that, but can entertain questions about in-ground gardens and larger gardens as well. So going through the planning process, the first thing is the plant list, and that is a list of all the plants that you're going to grow. So basically, we recommend that you grow what you eat. There's really no sense in your raised bed to put crops in that aren't going to be of some benefit. So don't grow it if you're not going to eat it or use it. Also want to look at, especially if you're in a small raised bed, nutrient dense foods. So a lot of your greens and your brassicas are very dense in nutrition. So focusing on that, and also focusing on things that are expensive to buy, right? So you can grow, one tomato plant can produce pounds of tomatoes. And as we know in the store, tomatoes, especially organic, are quite expensive. So kind of maximize your yield from the space that you have. So basically, when you put together your plant list, you want to, if you're buying seeds, you want to look at your seed packet and become very familiar with that, because there's a plethora of information there talking about, when to start your plants indoors, when they can be direct sowed, when they can be transplanted, things like that. All that information is on your seed packet, as well as how deep to plant the seed, how far to space out the plants, and also days to harvest. So you have an idea of when that crop's going to come to fruition and you can harvest it. So if you're doing succession planning or trying to get a fall crop, then you know when that crop will be finished and you can plan to plant another. So planting schedule, this is when you're going to plant it. And when determining when to plant things, you have to know a little bit about the crop. You have to know whether it's a hardy crop that likes can survive cool temperatures or prefers cool temperatures. Your half hardy crops, which aren't as hardy as some, so they need to be delayed a little bit, and then your tender and very tender plants. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the cool season plants will kind of define what separates these different types of crops. And then basically in your, if you have a schedule, it could be in a spreadsheet or just a handwritten thing that lists out the plants you're going to grow and when you're going to start the seeds indoors, direct sow them, or transplant, which seems to be missing from my example here. But one other useful thing would be when you put on here is when to harvest that. So yeah, that putting in when you can harvest a crop is also beneficial here. So you have your calendar, you can check and say, oh, it's time to harvest the spinach. Great. Seem to be having a navigation issue here. Hold on 1 second.
And my apologies, I had accidentally muted you before, Dave. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. But I seem to be a little bit frozen here. Oh, there we go. But that's not where I want to be. Oh, yes, it is. Okay. We're back. So the next thing in the planting plan is where to plant, and you can put together a little diagram. It doesn't have to be fancy like my drawing, but because that was basically done digitally. You can have a simple grid or garden layout, and you can handwrite in where you want to plant things. And when deciding on where to plant, you want to pay attention to a couple of factors. One is you want to pay attention to the shading of the plant. So if you have tall crops and you don't want them to affect access to sun for other crops, then you're going to want to put those in the north end of your garden. You're going to want to pay attention to good companions, bad companions. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but some plants like to be next to others and some like to be far apart. So there is information in our resource folder from the last class about what plants are good companions and what are not. So it doesn't have to be a fancy digital planting plan or garden map. You can just basically, as I drew down here at the bottom, I have this little grid which represents a 4x12 garden, and it's broken down into 1-foot squares. And you can use this to lay out your garden plan. Just handwriting in where you think you want to put your crops. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy, just something so that you have an idea of where everything's going to go. Then you end up, after you go through this process, with what we call a planting plan, which is, again, your plant list, what you're going to grow, your plant schedule, when you're going to get it into the ground or get it started, and then the final crop location. So those are kind of the highlights of that first class. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. One thing that we failed to mention at the beginning was throughout this presentation, if you have a question, feel free to enter it into the chat at any time. And when we have these Q&A breaks, Justin will be monitoring that, and he can feed me the questions so we don't spend a lot of time sorting through that for questions. Anyway, did we have any questions on that?
Not yet, Dave. So we'll probably, if you want to keep going, that's probably good. No questions yet.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, as we get into this, and I wanted to first start off with talking about plant needs. So, what do plants need to grow? And basically, these are the 4 major things. They need air, specifically carbon dioxide. Some plants also get their nitrogen from the air. They extract it from the air. They need sunlight. Sunlight provides the energy that plants use to combine with the air, the water, and the nutrients in order to photosynthesize and create sugars and mass, and basically to grow. So the light is the energy that makes all these ingredients come together. It's kind of an organic chemistry where there's biology and chemistry both occurring at the same time. So as I mentioned, water is the universal solvent. So that's a great medium for nutrients to be passed through the plant. The cells kind of take the water and pass it along. They take what they need. They get rid of their waste and goes back into the cellular waste gets carried away by the water. So the fourth thing is listed as nutrients, and note that it doesn't say soil, because soil is really a means to an end. Soil provides the nutrients, but it's not the soil that the plants need. So we'll talk a little bit about what nutrients are, and we'll talk now a little bit about soil. So first of all, what is soil? So soil is a combination of these components. There's biology, all sorts of bacteria, fungi, nematodes, which are worms, arthropods, beetles, all sorts of little bugs, critters, and microorganisms. And these all have a relationship with each other. Some are decomposers that break down materials. Some are prey for other organisms in the soil, and they all have a really unique relationship, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Other component are clay, sand, and salt. These are kind of the minerals and the substance of soil that, you know, when we pick up a handful of soil, it makes up a majority of that, but also organic matter. And organic matter is basically detritus from plants that have died and have fallen to the soil. So these are things that are not yet broken down. So all these together kind of make up what we call soil. So on this slide, I wanted to talk a little bit more about how soil functions, because as I said, it's kind of an ecosystem with its elements and relationships between these elements and organisms. And essentially they are taking the organic matter that falls onto the soil, they are breaking that down into building blocks, nutritional building blocks that other plants take up and use to grow and produce their own organic matter and biomass and fruit. So I kind of liken the soil to the digestive system of nature. So it's taking, like when we as humans, we eat, we're taking our fruits, our vegetables, or whatever it is we're eating, and we have a process of a mechanical breakdown, which is us, you know, cutting up food and chewing it. That's a mechanical one. There's a chemical breakdown where our saliva and acids kind of start to break that down. And then in our intestines, we get into the biology. There's bacteria that live in there that actually continue to break down our food so that it's in the small enough particles that our intestines can absorb that back to maintain our physical structure. So that's kind of the same with plants, but their digestive system is external and it is performed by other organisms. Okay, so when we're caring for our soil, we like to promote no-till gardening, and no-till gardening is important. Everybody knows what tilling is when you take soil and either with a rototiller and you churn that soil up at the beginning of a growing season, or if you take a spade and you're double ditch digging and flipping over the soil. That has kind of been a conventional practice for a long time, but we're learning more and more about the biology of the soil, and we're learning that tilling actually destroys the structure of the soil. So the structure is the biology that lives in that soil. When you take that, the biology likes to be at a particular depth in the soil, like different organisms like to be at different altitudes, if you will. And so when you take that and you flip it upside down, you're taking organisms who like to be down 6 or 8 inches down, and you're exposing them to sunlight and elements and wind, and they will not survive. So you're killing the organisms that are in the soil. And you're also breaking up the mycelial network, which is a fungal network that lives in the soil. And just envision, you know, many threads, single cell size threads that are interwoven, and it's a transportation system through the soil where water and nutrients are carried across this. So when you destroy that structure, that mycelial network, it makes it harder for plants to actually accent nutrients, because this mycelial network acts as an extension to the plant roots, and they actually, believe it or not, exchange nutrients with the plant in exchange for sugar, because the mycelium cannot photosynthesize and produce its own sugars, so it relies on the plant. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship there. So the point of all that is don't till your soil. mimic the natural pattern, and leave the soil alone. And over time, you will have healthier soil. Now, when you're installing a new garden, it's certainly acceptable to do that first initial till when you're mixing all your ingredients together, but it's best to leave it alone over the years and mimic nature to feed that soil. So that leads us into feeding the soil. So as I mentioned, the organisms and everything in the soil break down organic matter into these nutritional building blocks. So in organic gardening, we don't feed the plant, we feed the soil, and the soil feeds the plant. So it's a little bit of a shift from synthetic fertilizers, which give you those synthetic nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And that's basically plant ready and ready for that plant to suck that up. So it's much better to have that healthy soil. So cover the soil. Basically, there's a saying that bare soil is dead soil. Again, if you leave that soil uncovered, then it's going to dry out. The sun is going to kill the biology that lives on that surface, and your soil is going to die. Talking about mimicking nature. Yes.
Can I throw in a quick question that I think would be helpful at this point?
Absolutely. Yes.
Susan was just asking about, she said she covers her beds with fallen leaves. They break down over the winter to varying degrees, but many of them are left at this time of year. And she wanted to know, should she leave them or remove them?
Well, that's a great question. We'll get to that later, but I'll answer that right now. So if they're whole leaves, like non-mulch leaves, then I would recommend removing them and mulching them up, meaning breaking them down into smaller pieces and then spreading them back down. Because whole leaves, if they lay on top of each other like that, then it creates this mat and the soil can't breathe. It kind of suffocates the soil. So it depends on how heavy they are, how heavy of a layer. But ideally you want to have mulched leaves, chopped up leaves put on your garden, not whole leaves. So I hope that helps. And like I said, we're going to cover mulching a little bit more at the end, and we can talk about that.
Super, thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, so yeah, covering the soil. Basically, we want to protect the biology that's in the soil. So we want to keep a cover, and that can be either living plants or dead plants in the form of chopped up straw, leaves, dry grass, things like that. And again, we'll talk more about how to cover the soil later on. And the final thing that I want to say about soil care is go organic, because when you're adding the chemical pesticides and herbicides to your garden, then not only are you killing the biology that is in the soil, but your plants can take up some of those chemicals, and they can do harm to our own bodies. So it's best to leave those chemicals on the shelves and go organic. So no-till, well, I think I talked about all of this already in that last slide. So again, no-till mimics nature. In nature, there's the natural annual pattern of growth during the summer, and all of this biomass is created through the photosynthesis. And then the fall and winter come, and that new growth leaves and certain plants die off and fall to the soil. And the biology in that soil starts to shred those down, and slowly through, passing from one organism to another, breaks down into those building blocks. So we want to mimic that natural pattern, and we'll talk a little bit about living mulches and cover crops and chopping and dropping later on, but that whole process mimics nature. You grow a crop, you cut it down, you let it dry out, and the soil consumes it, and the next year you kind of do the same thing, and over time you're just continuing adding this organic material to the soil as food. So as I said, this no-till retains the soil structure, protects all of the living organisms that live in the soil, and it's less effort than tilling, frankly. So so the drawing in the lower left of this slide kind of depicts how we handle plants in a no-till environment. So the upper left, the plant, that's representing summer, and the plant is growing, and then To the right is fall. When you're doing your fall cleanup, you chop the plant right at its base and leave the roots in the soil. And then over the soil, over the winter, the roots start to break down. And in the spring, you can either plant around that stub if it still exists, or in some cases, like with corn stalks, you can just kind of pull the part that's above the soil out, and the rest of the roots have kind of detached from it and remained in the soil, but you're able to, that just kind of shows the process of the chop and drop, where you cut the plant down, let the roots decompose in the soil. So when we prepare our bed, these are kind of the steps that we kind of go through, and I'm going to talk about in the next series of slides. So that's the cleanup of your bed after winter. The snow melts, you go out there and you have all these leaves and such, and maybe some dead plants that are laying around. So you want to deal with that. Soil gets compacted, so you want to decompact it. And I'm going to go into detail about each one of these topics in the following slides, but then there's amendments that you want to add to your soil, because the previous year plants have extracted nutrients and minerals from the soil, and you want to make sure you add those back in. So, and then we'll talk about cover cropping. Cover cropping is used when you have an area in your garden that you're not going to plant a particular crop, an edible crop, for some time, like where you're going to plant your tomatoes and peppers. You might not plant those until end of May, early June. In the meantime, you don't want to leave that soil bare, so it can be good to throw down a cover crop. And again, in the fall, after you harvest a crop, you don't want to leave soil bare, so you can throw down a cover crop to start growing to protect that soil. And we'll talk about mulch. We'll talk about the technique of mulching and the different materials that you can use for mulch. Okay, so in the cleanup, basically any plants that remain from the previous season, oftentimes I leave a lot of my plants in my garden. As long as they're not diseased, I'll leave them over the winter, because that helps particular insects to overwinter, right? So if we cleaned up all our yards, got rid of all of our leaves, and got rid of everything, then some of our beneficial insects won't have a place to survive the winter. And so we want to maintain this ecosystem. So anyway, whether you do some or all, it does not really matter, but you want to kind of take those plants down. And what I do is in the springtime, the plants are all dead and dry, so I actually start chopping them up and putting them down as mulch right away to add that organic matter back. You want to remove any debris. So by that, I mean any fallen fruits and vegetables from the prior year. The picture in the lower left is one of our beds over at Dr. Crisp. This was a couple of years ago that I took this, and you can see these little yellow dots. Those are some tomatoes that had fallen off the vine the previous year and remained in the soil over the winter. And if they're still there in the spring, we want to get those out, because they can be a vector for diseases. So most pests and diseases overwinter in the soil. So ideally, you want to clean up all of this fallen fruit in the fall when you're putting your garden to rest, but your next best opportunity is springtime to remove that to reduce potential for disease. And spring is a good time to remove any unwanted volunteers, and most people call them weeds, but any plants that kind of pop up that you don't want, they're easy to spot in the spring, and they're also easy to pull up, because during the freeze thaw cycles of the winter, soil actually tends to puff up and expand, and so before that starts to get decompacted again by rain and watering, it's easy to just pull those right out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about decompacting, and as I mentioned, over time with watering a garden and rainfall, that soil tends to get packed down as the water falls and sinks. We know how things tend to settle. So in a no-till situation, the best way to aerate a garden is with a broad fork, and that's what's pictured in the lower right. You see the gentleman with the large blue tool, and the diagram in the upper right shows the 4 steps in broad forking. And note, this does not work in a raised bed because you're not going to be up on a 2-foot raised bed doing this. But let's go through the process where you put your fork in the ground, you kind of step on it and push it down, and then you pull back, and that just kind of lifts up the soil. And you don't turn it over or flip it, you just take your broad fork out and move backwards so that you're going on the soil that you've stepped on, and you decompact all that soil. A great substitute for a raised bed is to use a pitchfork. So you're not going to get in your raised bed and stand on it, but you can do the same exact motion with a pitchfork, where you stick it into the ground, and then you wiggle it and create space in that soil. The picture in the lower left is a bed that we did last year over at the Ledge Street Garden, where after that's a bed that's been aerated, and you see all the marks. Those are from the pitchfork of me putting that in there and aerating that bed. The reason that decompaction is important is that it makes it easier for plant roots to spread around and move through the soil. So the harder you make it for plant roots to move, the more energy they're going to use. And we want that to be, any energy that goes into roots forcing through the soil is taken away from energy that goes into fruit production. So that's why it's important to get that. So I want to talk a little bit about some amendments. The first one is compost. And if you're composting at home, then it's a great time of year to harvest your compost. Picture in the lower right is from my garden last year when I was harvesting my compost. And then I spread that throughout my garden, and I put some aside so that when I'm transplanting, when I dig my hole for my transplants, I put a little pocket of compost at the bottom of that to help feed that seedling as it's getting started. So other compost you can add to your soil would be manure, cow manure, chicken manure, horse manure, but it's best if it's already been composted to let it break down and kill some of the pathogens that may be in any of that manure. So one thing to note, chicken manure is extremely rich in nitrogen. So be careful when you add that. You don't want to burn your roots, the roots of your plants. So add that sparingly. So organic fertilizers is another amendment, and this is more used throughout the year to feed your plants, but you can add some as an amendment at the beginning of the year. And when we talk about fertilizers, they provide nutrients that plants need, obviously. But there are kind of 2 classes of nutrients. There are your macronutrients, which are your nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And then there are your micronutrients, which I don't know, boron comes to mind. I'm trying to, my mind is drawing a blank, but there's a number of micronutrients that plants need as well. When you buy synthetic fertilizers, they are typically nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. You don't get a lot of micronutrients in there. So that's why we recommend adding organic fertilizers along with some other amendments to make sure you get not just the macronutrients, but also the micronutrients. So another amendment would be minerals that you can add to your soil, and this can come in the form of store-bought products such as bone meal, blood meal, things like that. They come in basically crushed powder form, and as the picture shows up top, you just lightly spread these nutrients, these minerals onto the top of your garden bed. And in a no-till environment, I don't flip this over, but I don't just leave it on the surface. I'll rake the first, into the first inch or 2 of the soil, into that top layer of the topsoil. Some other amendments that you can add, stone dust is a great mineral amendment, as are eggshells and seashells. So anytime I go up, what question? Anytime I go out to eat for clams or anything like that, I take my shells home, I let them dry out, I crush them up, and then I add them to my garden. So good way to get amendments. And the same with my eggshells. I put mine mostly straight into my compost, but if you don't have a compost, you can still save your eggshells, let them dry out, crush them up, and then spread them around your garden. So another amendment you can add is biology. As I mentioned, soil is alive, it's full of living organisms, and you can brew something called compost tea, which is basically like it sounds. You take a shovel full of compost and you put it in maybe an old t-shirt or something, create a little tea bag, put it in a 5-gallon bucket, add some food for the biology. Let me back up and say that compost is going to be rich in bacteria and fungi and other organisms. But what we're interested in here is the bacteria. So we want aerobic bacteria. Aerobic means oxygen-loving bacteria, because there's also anaerobic, which we don't want. That's black, slimy, stinky compost. So anyway, we add our compost tea bag to the bucket. We put in some food for the bacteria in the form of maybe seaweed or molasses. We take a small pump, like from a fish tank, and we brew that tea for about 24 hours, letting that bubble and aerate through. And that's creating an environment where that aerobic bacteria will multiply. And then you take that compost tea and you spread it around your garden. And as long as there's lots of organic material in your garden, then that bacteria is going to thrive and start to break that down and create a healthier soil. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cover crops. And as I mentioned, the times to put on cover crops are when you have bare soil, either at the beginning of the season or the end of the season after harvest. And some of the cover crops that I like to put out are buckwheat, radishes, which is a dynamic accumulator and decompacts the soil. Peas, which are nitrogen fixing, meaning they take nitrogen from the air and they put it in the soil. And when you chop down those peas, that nitrogen is released and accessible to other plants. Let's see, a lot of people, oats is another good cover crop. A lot of people like to use winter rye. I'm not a fan of winter rye because winter rye does not get killed by the winter freeze, so it will keep coming back, and it works well in a till environment, but I prefer the no-till, so I don't use the winter rye. I make sure my cover crops will get killed by the winter, so I don't have to necessarily do anything with them in the spring. So the basic way to deal with the cover crops is the bottom two pictures are from my garden, and the picture on the left is the cover crops growing. So this is some buckwheat and radishes and things in there. And the picture on the right is after I planted it. So what I did was I chopped down all of these, all of this cover crop, and then I created pockets in order to transplant my crop, and left the mulch or the cut down crops as a mulch for my food crops. So as I mentioned, the cover crops protect the soil. They help to retain moisture, keep down unwanted volunteers or weeds from taking over the space, which is what happens if you leave a space bare. And it also adds nutrients to the soil. So I was going to show a little demonstration clip, but it might have been a little bit too long. So I've included in the resource file a video of a demonstration of chopping and dropping, but I'm going to walk you through a couple of the quick steps right here from that video. And so what you're seeing here is, this is one of our beds at Dr. Crisp a couple of years ago. That's the cover crops that we had planted at the end of March. And I believe this is end of May or so where we're preparing this bed. So that's what the cover crops look like. And then to cut these crops down, I cut them all at the base and then get a handful and break it down into pieces. There's no longer than your pinky. So we use the rule of pinky, where we want these small pieces because they'll break down easier if we threw down the crops as is, it would take a long time to decompose. It wouldn't be very useful. So this is kind of the process of going through and chopping the bed down, chopping and dropping, and that's what you end up with. And then after chopping and dropping that cover crop, it's best to add a brown mulch to that. And here we're using straw, so that's me applying some straw to the bed. And then you want to water that all in, and you've created this wonderful blanket of mulch on your bed. So this is, a couple inches thick at this point, so weeds are going to have a difficult time coming up. So this is a great way if you're doing transplanting, because then what you do is you clear a small hole for your transplant, you plant your seedling in there, and then you bring that mulch around that seedling, and it's good to go. The plant is transplanted, it's all mulched. I would recommend, well, yeah, okay. So mulching provides a lot of the same benefits as cover cropping, but this is done, after your crops are planted. Even if you're doing direct sow crops, when I direct sow seeds, I do a light mulch to allow those seeds to pop up, and then maybe apply some heavier mulch later on in the year. But if I'm transplanting into an area of a bed, I will mulch the entire bed first, and then clear the pockets for my seedlings, because it's a lot easier to spread that mulch on a empty garden than on one that has all these little seedlings in. Then you're worrying about burying seedlings, you're worrying about equal distribution of mulch, and it just becomes a lot more tedious. So you can also, excuse me, so some good mulches, chopped leaves, which is that picture up in the top middle there. That's my number one preference. Take my leaves from the fall, I mulch them up, store them in the shed, put them down in the spring. Straw is a great mulch as well, as is dried grass. You want to make sure your grass doesn't have doesn't have any seeds in it, and you want to kind of spread it out and let it turn brown before using it as a mulch. So another strategy that you can use is living mulches. So that's where you use a crop like white clover, or some ground cover like that will cover the bare soil, and it just remains living. And if it grows too tall, you can always chop and drop it, and let that material lie there. But it's a great way to kind of grow your own mulch as you need it. So I know that was a lot of information there. So why don't we take another pause here for some Q&A? I don't know, Justin, you got a long list of questions.
Sure, yeah. Question for you to start with, getting back to the fertilization. There was a question from Elizabeth about just some plants being heavy feeders and some plants being light feeders. And is that such a thing? How does that work?
That is absolutely such a thing. Corn is a very heavy feeder, so that requires a lot of nitrogen. So if you're growing corn, there's a couple ways to do it. You can either fertilize, every couple of weeks, if you're using organic fertilizer, every 3 to 4 weeks, put down some fertilizer, or you can plant a nitrogen fixing crop with your corn, like beans or clover or any legume, and they will help to add nitrogen. But yes, so the point of that question, I think, is to know your plants and know what their needs are. And it is true that there are some that are heavier feeders than others.
Great, thank you. Another question in regards to the cover crop. When do you plant that? You were showing the chop and drop. Specifically, when do you plant that, and where do you get that seed?
Okay, when to plant it, as I mentioned, cover crops are best at the beginning of the season or the end of the season. So right now we have snow on the ground, and the ground is still pretty frozen, so our soil is not workable. But when we get towards the end of this month and the soil becomes workable, which essentially means that it's fully thawed out and it's somewhat dried out. So if you pick up a handful of soil and you squeeze it in. First of all, if water drips out of it as you're squeezing it, it's probably too wet. But if it forms like a mud ball and doesn't break apart, then it's probably still wet. So you want to wait till you can squeeze a little bit of your soil and kind of have it just crumble apart. So the bed that I showed you in the demonstration, I believe that was planted, I don't know, I'd have to say, I could go check the dates of the files that I filmed these, but end of March, early April, I would say, is when you want to do that. And you want to do it in the areas that you are going to transplant into, areas where you're going to transplant warm season crops into. So if you're going to plant cold season crops like cabbage or broccoli or things like that, kales, you don't want to throw down a cover crop, because at the you can seed those or transplant those at the same time that you would plant your cover crop. So there's no sense to do that. And then at the end of the year, say, you pull up some squash or some beans that are done producing, then you want to throw down your cover crop there. And here in New England, probably early September is the latest you can sow a cover crop and have it be useful, because it wouldn't really take, if you sow it much later than that, then it won't have enough time to actually grow and do any good.
And one thing I know that our gardeners in the community gardens sometimes get tripped up by, and Linda had asked a question here about how do you actually sow your seeds or your seedlings in a bed that's covered with cover crop. And I think the important thing that we've found is that it is kind of overwhelming when you have a lot of stuff cover crop growing, and to know what's what. But I think you had mentioned kind of carving out a little spot where you could plant within that, and almost like its own little pocket inside of the cover crop if it's still there.
Right. And so all right, sorry, I'm just trying to all right, so the if you're going to direct sow any crop, really, cover cropping it's not good to cover crop in areas that you're going to direct sow, because even if you chop and drop a cover crop and you clear it out, the roots of those cover crops are still in the soil and alive, and those plants are going to start to regrow, and they're going to outcompete the seeds. So chop and drop, cover crops with chop and drop is really best if you are transplanting. That's, I think, the thing that I would keep in mind. So, and if you do want to direct sow and there is cover crop there, then I would recommend chopping it down. You can use that material to mulch somewhere else, but I would also maybe pull up some of those cover crops and just kind of work the first inch or so of that soil to create a nice clean palette, if you will, for the new seeds.
Yeah, you'd have to destroy their root structure, basically, the cover crop.
Yeah, basically, exactly. Otherwise, they're going to come back and outcompete the seeds. So, yes, yeah, that's true. And,
great clarifying question, Linda. Thank you for that.
Yes. I hope I clarified that.
All right. Yeah, you want to? I'll say we can save a few.
All right, I'll move on, and we'll have a longer Q&A at the end, and then people can drop off if they need to. But I want to try to finish the last few slides before our hour is up. Okay, so when to plant? We're coming into the time of year for cool season vegetables. So I should probably show this and then go back here. But crops are basically broken down into these two major categories: cool season crops and warm season crops. Within the cool season, you have your hardy and your half hardy. And then in your warm season, you have your tender and then your very tender. So picture this, our last frost in the middle there between the half hardy and the tender. So that gives you an idea of what comes before and what comes after our last frost. And I'm going to go oops, back to this here, and this just shows that here in southern New Hampshire, our average last frost is the middle of May, May 15th. And so that's kind of the cutoff for our half hardy and tender plants. So again, looking at this chart also gives you some examples of crops that fall into these categories. So our cool season crops, I'll talk a bit more about those in the following slides, but paying attention to the numbers at the bottom, these are the soil temperatures that that these seeds can germinate in. So when the soil temperature reaches 40-45 degrees, that's when it's time to start planting these hardy crops. And unless you have a soil thermometer and you're out there, measuring that, just kind of use the guideline of the hardy crops can go in when the soil is workable. And in this case, I would not worry about planting them too early, because the seeds will not germinate until the soil warms to the temperature that it requires. So the seeds, mimicking nature, plants produce seeds, they fall to the soil, they overwinter there, and then in the spring, when things warm up, they'll germinate at their appropriate time. So in the case of the hardy and half hardy, you cannot necessarily sow them too early. With the tender and the very tender, if you put the seeds in too early, they might start on a really warm day and then get killed on a cool one. So you really want to hold off on those until after the last frost. So here's some of the examples of what we call cold season vegetables. Your brassicas, which are your cabbages and kales, broccolis, cauliflowers, mustard greens, all of these things are in the brassica family, and they do well in the spring and the fall. So you can plant some for the spring and then sow some more seeds or transplant some more seedlings near the end of summer to have another fall crop. Greens are usually cold season vegetables, so that's lettuces and spinaches, kales, Swiss chards, things of that nature. Peas are cool season, so you can put those in the ground as early as you can. Onions and all your root vegetables, although there's a couple that require some warmer germination temperatures, and we'll see that coming up, but they are cold seasons. So some seeds that are best to direct sow or are candidates for direct sowing, these crops are all listed here on the right here: your arugula, beets, broccoli, carrots, kale, kohlrabi, lettuce, mustard, onions, and here I'm talking about the sets, which I'll talk a little bit more in a slide or two. Anyway, they're all considered cool season crops, and the right column there shows the temperatures which the seeds germinate, and the middle column shows you the number of weeks prior to our first frost that you would sow these seeds. So here we see carrots are 2 weeks before your first frost, so those are a little bit later, but most of these can be sown as soon as the soil is workable, or a week or two after that. And as I mentioned, and as demonstrated in the picture in the bottom left, after I direct sow seeds, I put a thin layer of mulch over there to kind of compromise between protecting the soil and allowing the seeds to germinate and pop through. Because if we mulched it too heavy, then the seeds that we just sowed would not be able to get through the mulch. So we want to kind of try to strike a balance when we put on that light mulch. So a couple of crops I'm going to talk about here are peas and onions. So these are both cool season crops. So peas come in a couple of common varieties: your garden green, which is kind of pictured in the bottom, where you get fully developed peas, and that's the goal, to get that legume. Or snap or snow peas, where you're going to eat the pod with the immature beans or peas inside. So those are the two different varieties. There are a lot of varieties within those categories, but those are the two main. And with the garden green, you can either eat them fresh when they're green, or leave them on the stalk till they dry and have dried beans. which is typically what I do in the fall with my pea crop, so I can have peas over the winter. Peas require support. They grow vertically. They have tendrils, so they can grab onto things. So putting some sort of a trellis for them to grab hold and grow is essential. I like to use a trellis structure like the one on the bottom, using horizontal layers of trellis, because if you have one trellis like this in the middle and you have your peas planted all around of it, they're going to all kind of grow up in the middle. I want my peas to grow up straight, so I give them this layer of trellis so every plant has something to grow up on, and I find it much it's better. Can find the adjective. So so peas like cool, moist temperatures, so that's why you want to get them out there as early as possible. They love that. And I have inoculate down here on the slide, and some people like to inoculate their peas with a bacteria that helps them. Remember, I talked a little bit about mycelium having the symbiotic relationship with plants. Nitrogen fixing plants have symbiotic relationships with a particular bacteria, where the nitrogen that the peas or other beans grow, that they capture from the air, they will actually ask the bacteria to store that nitrogen until it needs it later on in exchange for some sugar. So a lot of people like to inoculate their peas and their beans with this bacteria. It helps them to grow. Most soils have the bacteria in them, but if you're having a raised bed or it's a new garden, then inoculation can be beneficial. Okay, so onions, there are 3 different ways to plant onions. So they come in sets, which are basically onions that were planted in the fall and didn't reach full maturity, and then they go dormant. And once they go dormant, they're dug up and stored, and then they're sold and then replanted in the spring. So that gives your onion a head start. You could also buy seedlings and transplant those. That's the picture in the middle. You get, it's almost like blades of grass, and you lay those out and plant those, or you can direct sow by seed. And the diagram up top just kind of shows the phases of the onion and helps let you know when they're ready. When the stalk kind of breaks and starts to brown up, then you know the onion is ready to harvest. It's done growing. All right, so lastly, I believe, is talking about transplant candidates. So these are the cold season vegetables that work well as transplants. Note that the root vegetables don't transplant well, so there aren't any root vegetables on this list. And the chart just kind of shows, again, when it's best to transplant these, and it's all relative to your first frost. So again, here in southern New Hampshire, mid-May is our average last frost. Sorry, I say first frost. That should be last frost. My mistake. Yeah. So when transplanting, basically, you're going to dig your hole for your seedling. Like I said, I like to throw in a little bit of compost in the bottom there to give some extra food for the seedling when it's young. Then you kind of lightly tamp that transplant into the soil, not burying it too deep, trying to keep the crown of the plant right at soil level. So basically, the rule of thumb, when you get a seedling, basically you want to plant it to the same depth of the seedling, with the exception of tomatoes. Tomatoes like to be planted very deep, so that's an exception to that rule. Anyway, after tampering in the plant, then you water it in, and it is good to go. So here's a couple of slides here that just show some resources for you all to reference. Soil testing, the cooperative extension is a great place to get questions answered. You can call up their info line, and they'll answer any questions. And then I have some links to some articles that I referenced putting this presentation together with some more in-depth knowledge on these particular topics. So all of these links are in our resource folder, which I believe Justin will email to everybody after this so that you can find this resource file as well as a copy of the slides. All right, so
Thank you, Dave.
we'll,
Yeah, we have a few questions here. The first question is about onions. You mentioned onions were on the hardy list. Can you explain the difference between sets and bulbs and seeds?
Sure. So yeah, let me go back to that slide real quick. Oops, if I can. Okay, so so the three pairs of pictures at the bottom show the difference of these. The one on the lower left are the sets, and these are basically miniature onions. So these are onions that were grown in the fall to be used to get a head start on the following growing season. So they're the small dried onions. You can get them at Farmers Exchange. I think you can order them now. They're taking orders. Which reminds me, I didn't answer a question earlier about where to get cover crop seeds. The Farmers Exchange in Nashua is a great place for that as well. Back to the onions. So the onion sets are on the left, and these, as I said, these are onions that were grown in the fall of last year, and they were stored over winter and are getting replanted in the spring. The onion seedlings, which is the picture in the middle, you can buy those at any nursery. Usually the Farmers Exchange also sells those. You can order them, usually come in a bundle of about 50. And those are onions that were started, well, they're probably getting started now, or probably about a month or so ago. And so they were started this calendar year and will be planted this calendar year. And then you have your seeds, which you can direct sow. Was there another part to that question, or was it just looking for
No,
the difference?
that was it. That was it. In my experience, I have not grown from seed before, but I do find a lot of flexibility with the bulbs. They're pretty easy to get. You can kind of hang on to them a little while. There's not a huge rush to get them in the ground. And oftentimes we're going to have a bunch of those for our community gardeners this year to put in the ground. So those are very flexible and very easy to kind of plant at your leisure, versus if you get the starts and they're the third picture in there with the green tops, you kind of need to get them into the ground within a couple days of picking them up from Farmers Exchange. So
right.
just
Terminology wise, the question did talk about bulbs and sets. So bulbs and sets are the same thing. Just for
starts would be the correct terminology for that middle picture, right?
Correct. Starts or seedlings, yes.
Right. Another question was about, actually two of these questions we can kind of combine here. One of them was asking about, do you rotate your crops annually? And then specifically someone asked, what do I put where I had my potatoes last year?
Two great questions. Yes, you want to rotate your crops annually. Typically there's a 4-crop rotation, and so in a small raised bed like we have in Nashua, here at our Grow Nashua Gardens, our beds are 4x12, 4x10. Rotating crops is a little bit more challenging, and the benefits are not as great. The reasons why we want to rotate crops are twofold. One is, as I mentioned, disease and pests tend to overwinter in the soil. So if you have a pest in one year, and like tomato hornworm, and you plant your tomatoes in that same spot, then any of the hornworms that overwintered, when they wake up from their winter nap, they're going to say, oh, breakfast is right here. Here's my tomato plant. It's easy for them to find. If you put your tomato on the other side of the garden, that pest is going to have to work hard to find that again. And especially if you camouflage it with the companions that throw off aromas or things to confuse the pests. So the second reason is nutrient deficiency. Like if you put the same crop in the same location every year, it's going to be pulling the same nutrients year after year from that spot and deplete the soil. So by moving it around, you're giving that soil a chance um, to revive itself. So as I mentioned, corn is a heavy nitrogen feeder, and if you keep planting that in the same spot and you're not caring for your soil, then it's going to lack nutrients. What to put following tomatoes, I'll have to get back to you on that, because my focus has been all on this presentation and my brain can't recall crop rotation.
And
But one
potatoes
thing
are,
to note-
in general,
sorry.
potatoes they do, from people that I know that have grown potatoes and from my own experience growing potatoes are particularly important to rotate, because I think it's called the Colorado potato beetle tends to come back, and the eggs, I don't know if they last over winter or.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they overwinter as eggs or in the larva stage. Different bugs overwinter in different stages of their development. But yes, that's the pest. So one thing to note, that tomato is a nightshade, as are tomatoes and eggplants. So I can tell you for sure that you do not want to put tomatoes or eggplants after your potatoes. I believe carrots and beets and things like that are good. And I think in the 4-crop rotation, there's 4 categories, and I'll try to find some more information on that. I don't know if it matters which crop category you use after potatoes, as long as it's not in the potato group, so it's not any kind of a nightshade.
Great. Another question we had was, when your crops do show some type of disease or fungus, which they always do, some plant always does throughout the season, is it okay to eat the veggie? Is it okay to eat the veggie?
That depends. I would say if the fruit itself shows any disease, then no, I wouldn't. Sometimes, like, my tomatoes will get blossom end rot or something like that, and I'll cut off the affected part and eat the rest of the tomato, and I feel okay with that. But if you have like a fungal disease that's all over your tomatoes, then I would not eat that. So I mean, I think it depends. You have to use your best judgment, and if the part of the plant that you're going to actually put in your mouth shows signs of disease, I would say no. But if there's a couple of leaves that are diseased but the fruit looks okay, then
Sure.
I would think it's okay.
Like a tomato is a great example. Oftentimes by the end of the season, your leaves are just destroyed. They look horrible, but there's still fruit on there that looks pretty good and is fine to eat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then the last question that we had for the night was just about compost tea, whether you can put too much of it on your plants, and also about sharing your recipe.
Oh, okay. Let's see. You don't actually, I don't think that you can add too much compost tea to your soil. I think if there is more bacteria than there is food for that bacteria to eat, then it's just going to slowly die off. It's not going to cause any problems. So I don't think that you can add too much. One thing I do want to say is that compost tea can also be used as a foliar spray, where you can spray it onto your plants. So not pour it, but if you have a sprayer of some sort, much like our skin provides defense against harmful bacteria, plant skins also do that, and they partner with good bacteria to kill bad bacteria. Like, we have a lot of bacteria on our skins. We have good bacteria. We also have some bad bacteria on our skin, which is why when you get a cut, you want to disinfect so the bad bacteria doesn't get in. But with a plant, the same thing applies. So if you spray your plants down with compost tea, that can strengthen the immune system and be additional defense, immune support for the plant. My recipe for compost tea, I don't actually have a recipe other than what I had mentioned of, I've brewed it in a 5-gallon bucket, and I just take my tea bag of compost, fill it up with water, have my butter at the bottom. And then I add molasses, and if I have seaweed or some sort of a kelp, then that's a good thing to add there. But most of the time I just add molasses, which is just a sugar that's going to help that bacteria to reproduce. As to the amount of sugar, I can't recall what the portions are, but I can look that up and put that in the resource folder, so folks can access that afterwards. So make a note of that.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you, Dave, for putting this together for us and sharing all the facts that are in your head that we are fortunate. Those that see you on a daily basis are fortunate enough to pick your brain about. This last slide here is our little free farm stand. If any of you all are growing, Grow Nashua has a little free farm stand, and we put that out in the community. We basically have it there so that anybody who has some extra produce, if you have a great season because of all these nice tips that Dave gave us today, and you have an abundant harvest, which we hope you do, and you have a few extra things, you can bring them to the farm stand, and then families in the community that need fresh food, and they can come up and just get it for free. So it's kind of a great program that we have running to kind of allow community to support community, and everybody's welcome to bring and share and meet your neighbors. And we actually, I think this year we're actually going to have pickup sites that we place throughout the city. So we're going to have our three little free farm stands. We're also going to have a mobile unit that we're going to have dropping off at a couple other locations that we can't set up a farm stand at. And then we're going to have several drop spots throughout the city where people can leave things. So it's going to be super convenient. So this is our 3rd year doing it. And every year we've gotten a little bit more efficient and making it a little bit easier for neighbors to help neighbors. So appreciate those of you that have already been doing it with us. And yeah, we will look forward to hopefully seeing you at the farm stand or at a garden one day. Feel free to stop by anytime, and email Dave or I with questions, and we will send out a copy of everything, the slides and the resource links that Dave has gathered for us tomorrow morning. And yeah, enjoy the snow. Hopefully, maybe it's our last one, and if not, that's okay. But yeah, try to get those peas in the ground before the end of March.
Indeed.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you, Justin, for putting this together. Thanks everybody for attending. Much appreciated. And yeah, as Justin said, any questions, our contact info is on the screen there. So send us an email. Happy to get that back to you. There's a couple of links to videos also in the resource file. One that shows the chop and drop demonstration, but also one that shows the preparing of that bed that I chopped and dropped. So the sowing of those cover crops and whatnot. So those links are all in our resource file.
Superb. All right, folks. Have a good evening. Thanks again. We'll see you all soon.
Take care, everyone. Thanks, Justin.
Be well.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. All right.
All right. Thanks, Dave. That's great.
You're welcome. Yeah. I always get so nervous. I get all like, what I was gonna say. How it
That's
should be
great.
all happen.
That's good.
Yeah. Cool. So I'll put a couple of other things up in that resource file, the compost tea recipe and some information on crop rotation for folks up there.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, cool. Cool. The only other link that someone asked for was just the companion planting link that was, you had put one in the, It was in the other folder from the last.
Right. Okay, I can throw those links in there as well, or just copy that. Add that in there.
Cool, man. Wow, good job.
Cool.
It's good. A lot of good positive feedback. People are enjoyed it. So,
Cool.
did you want to export the chat again, or did you I forget. You think you figured out how to do that last time, didn't you?
Yes, it's over these three little dots, right? Save chat. Ooh,
Save,
yeah. Chat save.
There it is.
Show in folder. Okay, this is.
Oh man, the beginning of that with the news
Still
on.
recording. Okay. Yeah, you're still recording, by the way.
Oh yeah, send that.
Oh, that's right. I just saw that.